At the very beginning of the war, after the first Western sanctions were imposed, there were gloomy forecasts about what awaited the Russian economy. A sharp decline in GDP, the dollar at 200 rubles, hyperinflation, shortages of goods, and much more. But the most pessimistic forecasts did not come true, and the economy at first glance seems to be in good shape. Is it true? In the summer of 2022, at the height of the war, the Russian economy is not in the worst shape, as it may seem at first glance. In the second all-war quarter, GDP fell by only 4%, a severe drop that could set the economy back several years, but by no means catastrophic. The Russian ruble is worth about the same to the dollar and euro on the Moscow exchange as it was at the beginning of 2018. Back then, sanctions against Russia were not as severe, foreign companies and investors did not leave the country, and there was no serious talk of war. Since the beginning of April 2022, the dollar and the euro have depreciated by more than 27%. The consumer panic that gripped Russians in late February and early March has begun to subside. However, along with that came a decline in inflation. Year-on-year price growth is slowing down, while prices are falling month by month. Business sentiments even seem to be recovering slightly. At least, this can be seen in the service sector. However, according to the survey, industrial companies are far from optimistic. They are cutting output, complaining about shortages of certain raw materials, and low demand for their products. There are also problems with the production of cars. It fell by 85.4% in April because there were no imported parts. Now Russia simply buys cars from China, takes them apart for parts, and uses these parts to supposedly own domestic cars, selling them to Russians at 3 times the price of the car they bought in China. Even household incomes, which should have collapsed after the war amid high inflation and ruble devaluation in March, in the second quarter, if we believe the data of the Russian Federal State Statistics Service, did not fall much, only by 0.8%. We are talking about real disposable income, which takes into account inflation and mandatory payments. Some data showed that consumer demand has also begun to gradually come back to life. All in all, this picture allows the Russian authorities to claim that the economy is stabilizing and recovering from the crisis. The economic blitzkrieg against Russia initially had no chance of success, is how President Vladimir Putin described the impact of sanctions at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. He devoted most of his speech to how the Russian economy is coping with the crisis and how the Western countries are not coping at all with it. The same rhetoric was picked up by Russian propaganda, but economists think otherwise. The Russian economy is in crisis. It is just not a fast and rapid decline, but a slow and gradual decline, which will last for several years. Lingering fall. Those who thought the economy was like a light that could just turn off don't know how the economy works. Even during a very severe crisis in the 90s, life changed imperceptibly in 2 years. That's not how a crisis comes overnight, said Konstantin Sonin, a professor at the University of Chicago. In March and April, many were indeed waiting for the lights to go out, at least for a while. The gloomiest forecast the Bank for International Settlements had was a 15 to 20% drop in GDP. In the spring, however, Russian officials were also quite pessimistic. For example, in April, Alexei Kudrin, head of the accounts chamber, said that according to the official forecast of the Ministry of Economic Development, Russia's GDP would fall by about 10% in 2022. In May, the Ministry of Economic Development was expecting a drop of 7.8%, and in August, new forecasts from the ministry appeared in the media, a drop of only 4.2% this year. The central bank also markedly improved its forecast. By the end of April, the central bank expected an 8 to 10% drop in GDP in 2022, and inflation at the end of the year of 18 to 23%. The current forecast is more optimistic. GDP will decline by 4.6% in 2022, and inflation at the end of the year at 12 to 15%. The market economy is very flexible to changing circumstances. This largely explains why the Russian economy, despite such unprecedented pressure, did not give such a catastrophic decline as many expected. Another reason is Europe, which has not been and is not reducing its purchases of Russian energy resources as quickly as many expected, and it will take several years for her to completely abandon them. Huge exports of raw materials allowed the Russian state to have a huge budget surplus, which it used in the war against Ukraine. Also, the ruble was strengthened by the new rules of the central bank, which required paying for raw materials in Russian rubles. Despite all this, the prospects of the Russian economy are not the best. Inflation is quite high at 13 to 17%. Russia's economy has entered a recession. On top of this, The drop in world oil prices and the decline in European demand for Russian gas have caused Russia's surplus to shrink, which will make it much more difficult to finance the war in the future. At this point, there are several reasons for the deterioration of Russia's economic prospects: sanctions, falling prices of energy resources, the outflow of human capital. Due to sanctions, there has been a shortage of semiconductors and other parts. The Russian defense industry complex began to feel the problems. The military-industrial complex is not only tanks and fighter jets as you may think. It is engines for ships, helicopters, planes, electrical circuits and microchips, navigation systems, and even fire control systems for tanks. The list of imported components, the supplies of which have been sharply cut off, is quite extensive. For example, the Su-30 and MiG-29 fighters, which were powered by French navigation systems, were also left without them. 2. In February this year, Brent crude was worth about $100 a barrel, but by mid-June the price had already reached about $125 a barrel. This is good for Russia, given that it is the second largest oil supplier in the world after Saudi Arabia. The situation was roughly the same with gas. Russia gets about 1 billion euros a day from gas and oil exports. Such revenues allowed for a huge budget surplus. In January, it was a little over 250 billion rubles, but in June, when oil prices reached their peak, it was about 1.5 trillion rubles. In autumn, however, oil and gas prices started going down, and the budget surplus went along with it. Exports of Russian gas to Europe dropped by about 80%. In October, the budget surplus was only about 55 billion Russian rubles. With such a drop in revenues, it will be difficult to finance the war in Ukraine. In addition, the G7 countries and their allies officially approved a price ceiling on Russian oil. This came just after the EU was finally able to agree that the ceiling would be a price of $60. The G7 and Australia said in a joint statement that the cap would take effect on December 5, 2022. It was released after the European Union agreed on the price cap, convincing Poland to support it. Warsaw demanded a lower ceiling. The decision was made to prevent Russia from benefiting from its aggressive war against Ukraine, the statement said, but also aimed to support the stability of world energy markets and minimize the negative economic consequences of the Russian invasion. Russia has withheld any data on the economic status of Russian exports and imports and monthly oil and gas production. The central bank has stopped publishing reports, and even the Federal Air Transport Agency has stopped publishing data on air traffic volumes. No one knows exactly what is happening to the Russian economy because the authorities have stopped publishing accurate data, and the data that is published is most likely false, to show that the Russian economy is very strong and not affected by any sanctions. 3. The outflow of human capital. A lot of people left Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Often these are young, educated, and wealthy people. The exact number of people who left is unknown. According to some sources, from 500,000 to 700,000 people. The government understates these figures not to frighten people, or even says that everyone has already returned. It is known that from February to May, about 100,000 people working in the field of information technology left the country. And indeed, what are they to do in Russia when all the major Western companies have left Russia? Hence the shortage of specialists. All these people are leaving their homes and jobs because they no longer see a future in Putin's Russia. In addition to those who simply leave the country, some die in war. This is a huge number of people, mostly young people. This is already a big demographic problem. The departure of Western countries and technological sanctions will cause Russia to fall behind. The threat is not in the sphere of goods for final consumption, but in the means of production. If we can live without a new iPhone, the lack of supply of machines is a blow to business. This is not a short-term problem, but a long-term one for many years to come. Russia will not be able to fully integrate into the global economy, and this means that it will not be able to develop at the same pace and will lag behind the technological leaders. Nearly 1,200 companies have left the country since the war began. They ceased operations and closed stores across the country. This has resulted in the loss of about $200 billion in revenue and left hundreds of thousands of Russians jobless. All of these reasons are contributing to the destruction of the Russian economy. It is difficult to predict what will happen to the Russian economy in 2023 because it depends on many factors. There are different forecasts, but one thing is certain. If Western economic sanctions and the trade embargo on oil and gas continue, Russia's economy will collapse.